Thank you. Well, it's great to be here, and thank you for that reception. I hope I can live up to it. And what I want to do today is, I was asked to talk about how we can use pharmacology to approach harm reduction in terms of drugs and drug use. So that's the core of my talk. But I also wanted to thank you for moving Norway into the 21st century in relation to drug control. It's very exciting that you're doing that. And I have to say, you're moving rather faster than we are in the UK, where we're going back to the 13th century, but that's another story. So congratulations on that. But I also want to lay down a challenge, which I think you've already had mentioned by the previous speakers. I want to actually encourage you not just to do what you need to do for Norway, but also for the rest of us. That isn't Oslo. That's Jerusalem. Hopefully you're all aware of that. But that play is a remarkable... Any of you seen it? So that's a remarkable play. It's just been released in London. I saw it 2 weeks ago. It's a play about how Norway essentially brokered the first ever Israel-Palestinian peace deal. It was a very difficult thing to do. It took many years. In fact, arguably, Norway is the only country in the world capable of doing it because of your reputations for independence, integrity, discretion, and I suppose the fact that you do still host the Nobel Peace Prize. So Norway does have a reputation in the world that's really justified and greater probably than any other countries. So if you really want to take the lead in international drug policy, I can tell you there's no opposition. And I, for one, will be delighted to work with you because we do need to change the international perspective as well as your national one. Okay, so we'll get you sorted in the next year and then we'll take on the WHO, all right, and the UN. Okay. We've got 2019, isn't it, Steve? UN Gas 2019? If Norway would like to lead a coalition of forward-thinking countries, then I think you'd have quite a lot of support internationally. So that's my pitch for your future. Let's just talk about the present. Just to emphasize that drug policy in the UK is probably as bad, if not worse, than yours. Here's a recent coroner's court. This young lad lived in Kent, and he went out to score some cannabis, which is illegal in Britain. So it has to be bought from dealers. He got to the dealer, and the dealer said, "Hey, I've got, as well as this dope, I've got some great E for you." So he bought the E as well as the dope, and unfortunately it wasn't E, it was F for fentanyl, and he died as a result of taking fentanyl, thinking it was ecstasy. And that illustrates, of course, many of the problems we have, that not only do people not know what they're taking, but also dealers often don't care. And whether the dealer knew it was fentanyl or not, it's impossible to ascertain. One thing we are sure of is that fentanyl deaths and all the... This is not high enough. Okay, is that better? Shall I start again? Welcome, Norway. No. One thing we can be absolutely sure of in the UK is that deaths from fentanyls will rise and rise and rise over the next few years. So, at the very least, try to have some policies here which will prevent that happening. Now, I'm aware that getting engaged in this policy area is sometimes a risky, challenging business. So, for those of you who are also putting their careers on the line, I'm with you as well. But that's me being sacked by the government for arguing that some drugs, like cannabis, were actually rather less harmful than they've been made out to be, and that they were certainly less harmful than beer and cigarettes, which you can see on the scales of justice, weighing them down there. And but the point about that cartoon is that the public debate started. And one thing is clear, and I was very encouraged by what your politician said this morning, that Once a debate has started, you can't ever get rid of it. People can never forget there has been a debate. And as we know, over the last century, the whole policies around drug control have been to stop debate, to stop the truth being told, to stop any kind of engagement. So whatever you do, you're going to be making progress. So please, keep the debate going. Make it as popular and as open as possible. But we might need to take the debate into one or two other new areas. One of the things I discovered when I started working with my government on drug policy and drug harms was that we had no definition of what a drug was. And I discovered that nor does the UN, nor does the WHO. And that actually is a huge issue, because it means then that drugs are whatever politicians want drugs to be. That's a particular problem in my country, as I'll show you at the end of this talk. But it's something that you must guard against everywhere. And there is a particularly challenging element of society that does have quite a biased view as to what drugs are, and that's the drinks industry. And the drinks industry are extremely keen that this drug ethanol is never considered a drug. And you can make a case, it may not be an infallible case. You make a case that a lot of drug policies over the last 150 years have been subtly driven by the drinks industry to remove all competition. And actually, they've been pretty successful. And just be aware of that, because whatever we do, they're not going to sit down and take it lightly. They are going to fight to keep their corner of the market. We've already seen in the USA, where recreational cannabis markets have been allowed in some states, that the alcohol industry has been one of the main funders of the anti-legal cannabis movement. And it's very likely that they're working behind the scenes here. They're certainly working extremely hard in the UK to try to prevent progress in terms of liberalising drug policy. But to get to the main part of my talk, I was asked to talk about reducing harms by finding alternatives. And here are just some examples of that that go back over a century. You can argue that the origins of the injection of heroin using a hypodermic syringe in part came from the banning of smoking of opium. I'll show you about how cannabis bans are leading to the problems with spice, synthetic cannabinoids. And to some extent, cracking down on cocaine, that was a joke, sorry, leads to crack. The attempt to get around the controls on LSD and psilocybin have led to the rise of N-bombs and related compounds. I'll talk about saffron and MDMA and the PMA problem that you have here in Norway. And of course, the attempts to control or to get around the controls on heroin have led to this major problem with synthetics, some of which were legal, like the Allen Hanbury compound, but most of which are illegal, like the fentanyls, but which are enormously problematic. Last year in Britain, 40 different fentanyls were discovered. And that presents enormous problems, because the idea that you can test for 40 separate compounds in any sensible fashion at the point of use is very, very challenging. And I think fentanyl is going to present us with quite a conceptual challenge in terms of how we deal with drugs. Well, let's look at some of these in a bit more detail. Here's cannabis, as you're all aware. Cannabis wasn't really a problem until my government, started to test people for using it. It hangs around in the blood, in the fat for weeks, so a single inhalation can be detected perhaps for 2 or 3 weeks afterwards. So testing it is very easy, and what you're testing doesn't necessarily have any relationship to any kind of mental impairment, but it's adequate to penalize people, and particularly in the case of prisoners, to take away their rights of a shortened sentence under parole. We started doing that because we could. Just as an aside, I think one of the more unpleasant aspects of the current technological advances we see in terms of drug testing is how there is enormous commercial interest in making testing kits. So there's a whole army of individuals or companies that are selling to governments the idea that you can test your way out of the problem. It's like another war on drugs. It won't work, but it will make a lot of people a lot of money. And I think we need to be very cautious about the idea that testing is the solution. I'm not sure. It may realistically be more a part of the problem, and it has been in the case of cannabis. Because to avoid testing, we've seen the development of synthetics. And there are a lot of synthetics. Probably an infinite number if you really think about it, but there's certainly way more than we can know about at present. And people turned to synthetic cannabinoids because they weren't testable. But they weren't aware of the fact that many of the ones that they first started to use were drugs which were synthesized 20, 30 years ago. They were synthesized when the medical benefits of cannabis became apparent. And they were synthesized to be alternatives to cannabis. The fact none of them ever made it as medicines is a testimony to how unpleasant and difficult to use they were, because they're particularly horrible when you use them for indications like nausea or to reduce spasticity. They never got on the market because no one could tolerate them. But now they're being widely used because at least you can't test for them. So we've created this serious problem. We've opened this Pandora's box of hundreds, if not thousands, of these synthetic compounds, which we know to be unpleasant. We don't know if they're safe. We presume that they're actually unsafe. There are many more deaths from synthetic cannabinoids in any 1 year than there have ever probably been in the history of cannabis. But people are still using them, and we've now got to a situation in our open prisons where maybe 3/4 of all prisoners are using them. And they're using them because they can't be tested for. But more than that, they're actually much more potent than cannabis, so they can be smuggled into prisons by prison guards. It's estimated about 5% of our prison staff are now drug dealers. It's extremely easy to get small pieces of paper infiltrated with these drugs into prison. You can double your salary by being a drug dealer with these drugs. So we don't need them. We never needed them, but the market has provided them because we were so hysterical about the herbal cannabis. And every now and then we have epidemics like this one in Manchester a few months ago where a group of dealers decide to sell a very potent synthetic cannabinoid on the streets. The street population are quite vulnerable. We've seen almost a complete switch in Britain now. Now people don't sleep in doorways of shops with a bottle of vodka by the side. They sleep because they've taken synthetic cannabinoids. And sometimes they do more than sleep. They either die or they go into catatonic states like that, you can see there. And that has now become an enormous burden on the health services. So when an epidemic of this drug use hits a town, it creates a huge health burden as well. Here's another example of how prohibitionist policies create more harm. This is a problem that I believe you have here in Norway. It's something we have in the UK. So that graph shows the rise in the number of people dying from PMA or PMMA over the lifetime of that graph, which is what, I don't know, how many years? 20 years. Both these drugs were made illegal in 1971 under the UN Convention on Psychotropics, so they've been illegal. But nothing much was happening with them till about 10 years ago we started seeing people dying. And that was quite a surprise to us. Why would that? Why would these illegal drugs, which no one was using, suddenly turn out to be being used? And of course the story is a fascinating one. It's because they kind of look chemically rather similar to MDMA. So you see there on the left-hand side MDMA, on the right-hand side PMA, and they're actually very similar compounds, apart from the MDMA has 2 oxygens and the PMA has 1 oxygen on this side of the benzene ring. Well, what is the story here? Well, the story is basically this. The story is that MDMA, as you know, was made illegal around about the 1980s in most countries. It was made illegal because governments didn't like the fact that kids were having fun. Well, actually, it wasn't even governments, it was newspapers. There was hysteria about the idea that people might go and have parties without drink. And the drinks industry got very worried that their sales were falling. It's the only time in the history of Britain since the Second World War that drink sales have not climbed incrementally year on year, was when the rave culture started. So there was pressure to get MDMA banned, ecstasy banned. And it was banned in all countries pretty much. But that didn't stop use. So the United Nations was scrabbling, how can we stop the use of this substance? How can we continue to try to stop kids having fun? And they hit upon the idea of banning the precursor of saffron. So here you see there's saffron, which is the precursor of MDMA. Saffron comes from sassafras oil. Sassafras oil at that time was largely extracted from plants growing in tropical forests. And a lot of it was made in Thailand. So in 1998, the United Nations decided it was going to ban the production of saffron and a number of other precursors for different drugs. This was the precursor ban. And that ban didn't do very much until about 2005, when a massive seizure of saffron was made in Thailand. 50 tons of saffron was seized. Half the world's supply per year was seized. And that was celebrated. The United Nations front page of their newsletter, we have broken the back of the MDA production. We will eliminate ecstasy because people will no longer have the precursor to make it. Now, the problem with this approach is really very straightforward. If you're an underground chemist in China and you've got an order for a kilo of MDMA and you're waiting for your saffron to come, and someone says, sorry, we've got no saffron, you don't say, oh, damn, I'll make antibiotics instead. No. No, you say, I've got 2 weeks to deliver. What can I find that looks a bit like saffron, that will go through the same chemical reactions that I use to make MDMA? And they hunted around and they found aniseed oil. Now, aniseed oil cannot be banned because you're all wearing something that's got aniseed oil in it. It's a vital product in foodstuffs, it's in cosmetics, toiletries, etc. It's one of the most widely used essential oils in the world. So it's legal. The problem is when you turn aniseed oil, put it through the same reactions as saffron, you don't get MDMA, you get PMA. So the rise of deaths from PMA and PMMA, depending on what reaction you use, you get one or other. That's completely attributable to the desire of the UN to get rid of the precursor. So the UN has created those deaths. All those thousands of deaths have been created by the policy of trying to eliminate saffron. And the reason PMA and PMMA kill you is that they're not as good as MDMA. They come up more slowly, so people, when they use it, think they've got a bum deal of MDMA. They don't get the come up early. So then they take 2 tablets, which means they've overdosed because they end up with 3. When the effects do come on, the effects are not just the MDMA-like effects, which is to release serotonin, but also these drugs also block the metabolism of serotonin. So people end up with what's called the serotonin syndrome, which can be lethal. So these drugs are much, much more toxic, and they exist simply because we've made it difficult for chemists to make MDMA. I suppose the only good news is that now chemists have worked out how to make saffron without extracting it from sassafras plants. So now we're going back to a new world, but we're going back to a world now which you'll hear about in the next talk. A world where there's so much MDMA being made because people have cracked the saffron problem that now we're having more of it around and people are getting into problems for that reason as well. But that introduces you to one of the key points that I'm going to make in my talk today, which is that we do have safer stimulants. Benzylpiperidines, party pills, were widely used in New Zealand when they tried to get people moved from a methamphetamine, crystal meth, back in the 1990s, early 2000s. They were available quite in a relatively non-regulated way, which is probably the reason eventually they got banned. The regulated market might have actually minimized the side effects of them. In fact, the harms were pretty limited In the end, the New Zealand government decided to ban them on pretty tenuous health grounds. But it was an interesting example, and it's a proven example of how you can have a regulated stimulant market. I'm going to talk about mephedrone in a minute, because mephedrone does present to us probably the most interesting natural experiment in the history of drug use, and at least in relation to stimulants. And in the UK, for a long time, we were using methiopropamine. It was sold, probably about 1 million doses every weekend was sold in head shops. It was a kind of Mars stimulant. It's probably equivalent to about 2 coffees. But because it's a white powder and it bubbles up when you take it, it's psychologically much more fun than coffee. And you don't have to pee as much, but it probably isn't any more harmful. So those are examples of stimulants which do have recreational value that are relatively safe. But the mephedrone story is a salutary one. So this is a map of Google hits on mephedrone in its lifetime. Mephedrone also was known as MCAT or Meow Meow or Drone. And you can see there was relatively little interest in it until an article at Point A, when the New Musical Express wrote a commentary on people using it. That didn't change the profile very much. But when the Daily Mail, when the right-wing British newspaper starts complaining that people are using it, then there's suddenly a rush of interest. So the Daily Mail and the Sun criticize drugs partly in order to promote their use, so they can find evidence of harm from which they can then use to justify agitating to get them banned. And this is truly one of the most fascinating headlines I've ever read. Legal drug teen ripped his scrotum off. You might ask, people often say to me when I'm giving this talk overseas, is that English? And I say, no, it's Sunnish. I have no idea if that's true. We think it probably isn't true because the Sun didn't know who the person was. It was just a story that was created and told to them that they were happy to repeat. But that kind of scare is enough to get governments very, very worried. And in fact, mephedrone was banned without, as far as we know, it having killed anyone. And we're pretty certain it's relatively safe because it was an Israeli drug. It was used widely in Israel from about 2004 to 2006. And the Knesset report on mephedrone estimated about 450,000 young Israelis had ever used it. And they couldn't find a single death in Israel. And that means it must be a pretty safe drug. But our government was determined to ban it because an election was coming up and it seemed like an opportunity to pretend or to show that the party in power, the Labour Party, was hard on drugs. So it got banned. Now, people will say, well, but banning drugs can't do any harm, really, can it? It probably isn't completely safe. So why don't we ban it just in case it's not very safe? Okay. Well, this is why the experiment of mephedrone is fascinating, because for 2 years, mephedrone was legal in Britain. It was a legal stimulant. You could buy it. It was sold in 1 gram quantities, and you could order it on the internet or drop into your local head shop and get it. So there was a lot of use. And this shows the impact of mephedrone on deaths from 2 more harmful stimulants, cocaine and amphetamine, mostly amphetamine sulfate. And what you see is staggering. You see the rise in cocaine deaths and less of a rise in amphetamine deaths over the decade before mephedrone enters the market. You see that rise in this? Now, one of my challenges as the government's advisor on drugs was to try to reduce the rise in cocaine deaths. Completely failed. There was no way we could think of that could stop cocaine deaths rising because people wanted to use it. But when mephedrone came along, people switched. People switched from cocaine to mephedrone and from amphetamine to mephedrone because it was legal. You wouldn't get arrested. And also, you got what it said on the packet. You got 1 gram and it was clean. And it wasn't cut. And you can see the remarkable impact. You see, cocaine deaths halved in the space of 2 years. Now, I don't think ever in the history of drug control has a policy achieved such a massive impact. Particularly a policy that was simply giving people access to something safer. This is truly one of the most remarkable experiments there's ever been. Now, after the drug was banned, because the Sun and the Mail wanted it banned, there was a year when people carried on using because they were stockpiling, and then you see the cocaine curve switch back. If everything's illegal, you may as well just take the best stuff, which is cocaine hydrochloride, in case you weren't sure. Okay. And now we have the highest number of cocaine deaths ever. So I think that graph just shows that methadone probably saved 300 to 400 deaths in the time it was available, from reduced deaths from cocaine, reduced deaths from amphetamine. So this was a fantastic harm reduction, completely market-driven, and we've now lost it. And this is just a schematic of the comparative harms of different stimulants, showing that methadone is probably the least harmful of the commonly used stimulants. A rule of thumb, if a gram of the pure substance doesn't kill you, it's pretty safe. That's safer than caffeine. Just remember that. A gram of caffeine would give probably half of you fits, okay? Well, that's modern empirical science, but it's not rocket science. We've known this for a long time. We've known that we can make safer alternatives to all sorts of drugs. We can make safer alternatives to legal drugs, like e-cigarettes, vaping, or snus, much loved in Norway now. We can make safer alternatives to illegal drugs, like buprenorphine was developed specifically as a safer alternative to heroin and methadone. And I've shown you that cannabis is a much safer alternative recreational drug to spice. And countries which have a rational cannabis market have much less in the way of spice problems. Just want to give you a couple of examples of these just to show that there is data. So some of you probably know we've been pioneering this technique of multi-criteria decision analysis to try to get the best estimates of the comparative harms of different drugs. This is a study we did a few years ago now looking at nicotine products. And basically the higher the graph, the higher the bar, the more harmful it is. So you see there the comparative harms of different nicotine products. On the left hand, cigarettes. And those different color bars show the different contributions that these 16 different harms make, or 14 different harms make to the harms of those drugs. So cigarettes, scoring at 100 there. Snus, introduced in Norway, I think about 6-7 years ago, showing a harm ratio of about 5% of that of tobacco cigarettes. And e-cigarettes ends showing a ratio of even less. So here we have two products which we've now got good evidence are massively safer than cigarettes. But we've also got this paradox that the WHO is trying to ban them. In fact, many countries have made them illegal. There are people in prison for selling them in India, even though they're much safer than cigarettes. So the WHO has decided, because it cannot win the war against cigarettes, it will win the war against these self-alternatives, which is an outrageous approach for a health organization to be pursuing. But it is. But at least, as I say, in your country, you've endorsed snus. And the Norwegian snus experiment actually is changed the way people used to say, well, snus only worked in Sweden because they were strange people. But if it works in Norway, where you're normal people, then it must be all right. I kid you not. Here's an interesting comparison we did of different opiates. So we looked at the harms of, there's about 10 different opiates. Injected heroin on the left, codeine tablets on the right, looking at the harm to others and the harm to users, the others as in the black bars. And you can see there's a marked gradation. Some forms of opiates, such as buprenorphine, Suboxone, tramadol, they're considerably less harmful than injected heroin, fentanyl, etc. So we can use sensible, proven estimates of the different harms of drugs to come up with semi-quantitative parameters of harm, so we can make decisions and be relatively confident if we're talking about drugs having different levels of harm, that we are at least we've got some foundation in evidence. So could we move on then? Could we move on to find safer alternatives to alcohol? I would argue that nitrous oxide is a safer alternative to alcohol. And in fact, I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Alcosynth, I'll talk about. I've talked about mephedrone. There are many other cathinones which could potentially be safer alternatives to cocaine or amphetamines. But now most countries have made them all illegal, so there's no incentive to develop them. And I'll talk about methoxetamine for ketamine. So let's look at nitrous oxide. So nitrous oxide is a great British drug discovered in 1802 by that man, who happens to be a Bristolian like me. So. In 200 years, as far as we know, there have been no deaths. Nitrous oxide was used by scientists in the 1800s to experience altered consciousness, to think about the brain and the mind. It was used by poets like Coleridge and Southey to get visions that they could write their poetry about. It's been used, of course, by millions of women for childbirth, and hundreds of millions of women all over the world for 150 years. Even Prince Harry was happy to use nitrous oxide. That's okay, everything's okay, until soccer players start using it, and young people start using it regularly. And it's become a bit of a fashion in the UK now. And young people have turned to nitrous oxide rather than alcohol. For these reasons, the effect's pretty fast. It's very fast in onset. It's quite fun. You get over it quite fast. And that has a number of advantages. You're not drunk. If you're really intoxicated, you can be drunk for hours, and that puts you especially if you're a woman, puts you in a state of great vulnerability, maybe for hours. And that doesn't happen with nitrous oxide. You recover quickly. You can drive home within an hour, which means that you can go to parties and that's why one of the things, the loss of hangover is hugely important. That's why soccer players use it, because it means they are not impaired the next day. It's less toxic. 5,000 deaths a year at least from alcohol in Britain, about 3 from nitrous oxide. And it's less addictive. So there are many reasons why young people are using nitrous oxide. But the sun hates young people using drugs. It hates soccer players using drugs. And it's managed to we've now made nitrous oxide illegal in our country. One of the ways that newspapers work to get drugs made illegal is by creating hysteria about them and by changing their name. So here you see the old term laughing gas, which is completely innocuous and wouldn't upset even your grandmother. But when you say it's there, did you know that these young people are using hippie crack, Granny? Oh my God, hippies, tie-dyes, and crack. We're all going to die. Manson's back. It's an absurdity. But that's how the newspaper has created sufficient hysteria that this drug is now, illegal in this country, in our country. And I just want to show you. Here's 2 soccer players using nitrous oxide. So the one on the left is Raheem Sterling, and he's using it at a party, so he can play soccer the next day because he won't have a hangover. And the one on the right is Luke Shaw, who's using nitrous oxide to deal with the pain of his leg, which was broken in 3 places. And I ask you to decide which is good and which is bad. And of course, both are good and both are bad. But there is this complete paradox that when people are given nitrous oxide for sport, when they're injured, people don't tell you it's nitrous oxide. They say he's given oxygen. Well, it's not. He's playing at sea level. He doesn't need oxygen. He's been given nitrous oxide. But again, so we deny the value and we exaggerate the risks. And now it's illegal in Britain. And there are people in prison for selling it, and there are many court cases. And this emphasizes the point I made at the beginning, that at least you are going forward, and my country's gone backwards. Ketamine. Well, ketamine's been around for a long time. It's a great drug. It's a great anesthetic. You use it on the battlefield. You use it in children. Vets use it. The reason it's such a good anesthetic is it doesn't suppress respiration, so you do not need anaesthetists to ventilate people. But it's used recreationally, and some people become dependent, and some people use it in high doses, and then they get into problems like particularly bladder damage. Well, one recreational user of ketamine decided that he wanted to stop having the K cramps, his bladder cramps, so he was, being a chemist, he decided to make an alternative. And he decided to start with methoxetamine, which became called Mexi. Methoxetamine is somewhat similar. It's slightly longer acting than ketamine. It's slightly more activating, slightly less sedating. As far as we know, it's a good painkiller. He found it useful for that purpose. But because it was legal, it became the subject of inquiry by the newspapers. That term Mexi, Mexicans, nasty people, that kind of illusion that is so common. And Mexi got banned. But worse than Mexi getting banned, my government decided to ban every conceivable alternative to ketamine. Hundreds of compounds that have never been made were banned. And so basically we have no alternative now. Commercially, no one's going to develop an alternative to ketamine because all the drugs will be illegal and therefore expensive to develop. And in clinical and recreational use, why bother? Let's just go back to the old proven but probably more harmful drug. Now, what about drink and alcohol? Well, I've argued for a long time that it's impossible to find ways of moderating the toxicity of alcohol because alcohol has to be metabolized to acetaldehyde. If alcohol was produced today as a medicine, it would never get through regulatory requirements because the maximal safe dose per year is half a glass of wine per year in pharmaceutical terms. But we'll ignore that because it's been around for so long that we're quite happy to poison ourselves with alcohol. But there are alternatives. That's the good news. The good news is that modern neuroscience has given us alternatives. There are a number of substances we've identified which can give you the good effects of alcohol, but without the liver toxicity and the heart problems and the high blood pressure, etc. And I've written about them, and those compounds exist. They're in the process of being developed. The problem is, in my country, we don't even know if they're legal now because we have brought in an act that bans every psychoactive substance other than alcohol. However, Norway, hopefully you're more rational, and you're also a lot richer than we are, so if there's anyone here who wants to invest in Arcosynth, can you see me afterwards, please? And if it's the government, the more the better. So I just want to finish, because I've criticized politicians, I've criticized the media. I think it's also important to criticize scientists. I'm a scientist. But one of the problems we have talking about drugs is that there is often a collusion between some scientists and some in the media. And this is Dilbert, my favorite cartoonist. There's Dogbert saying, I need 3 bitter and unsuccessful scientists and 100 lazy journalists. And Ratbert says, very good. And the next day, there's a story in the newspapers that Dilbert reads, did you know toddlers thrive on pollution? And you can, if you get the right combination of scientists and media together, you can get papers published saying ecstasy causes brain damage and cannabis causes schizophrenia, LSD makes you insane, etc., etc. And I think it would be fair to say that the worst science in my lifetime, in any discipline that I know, has been the science of drugs. In fact, most of it isn't science, although it's purported to be. So I'm going to finish now. I'm going to, as I say, I'm here to celebrate what you're doing and to encourage you to do more. And if you want, when you're arguing with your politicians, you're arguing with your newspapers, particularly when you're arguing with your parents, use this position statement from John Stuart Mill. In a freedom-loving society, no conduct by rational adults should be made criminal unless it's harmful to others. That should be the underpinning principle under all of our laws, and it certainly should be the one underpinning the drug laws. So remember that, use that, and if you can't remember it, buy my book. All the proceeds go to my charity, Drug Science. And in the audience here is an extremely enlightened man, because he came to me this morning with 4 copies that he'd bought for Christmas presents. And I thought that was the wisest thing I've ever seen anyone do. I signed them all, and I'd do the same for you if you buy them. Thank you very much.